2 1,000-pound bombs under the wings, one 500-pound bomb under the fuselage center, and 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, HVARs, on zero-length stub launchers. Total ordnance load, 2,500 pounds of bombs plus 10 rockets. Combined explosive power roughly equivalent to 3 155mm artillery batteries firing simultaneously. And unlike artillery, which took time to register targets and adjust fire, the P-47 pilot could see his target, dive on it, and deliver precision strikes in seconds. The armor-piercing incendiary ammunition was particularly effective against vehicles. Each round could penetrate the top armor of most German tanks, where armor was thinnest. Against trucks, half-tracks, and soft-skinned vehicles, the effect was devastating. Fuel tanks ignited, engines shattered, crews killed or wounded. The HVARs added a dimension of destructive power previously reserved for medium bombers. Each 5-inch rocket carried a 24-pound warhead capable of penetrating 4 inches of armor plate. Against vehicles in column, a salvo of 10 rockets could destroy multiple targets simultaneously. But perhaps most importantly, the P-47's structural strength and heavy armor made it survivable in the ground attack role. Unlike lighter fighters that were vulnerable to ground fire, the Thunderbolt could absorb hits from rifle-caliber machine guns and even 20mm light anti-aircraft weapons and continue fighting. Major Quincy Lee, commander of the 362nd Fighter Group's ground attack operations in France, filed a report in May 1944 that summarized the P-47's capabilities. The P-47 has proven itself the premier ground attack aircraft in any air force. During April operations, our group flew 847 ground attack sorties with the following results: 189 locomotives destroyed, 423 trucks destroyed, 47 armored vehicles destroyed, 89 railway cars destroyed, 34 bridges damaged or destroyed, 12 ammunition dumps destroyed. Aircraft losses, 8 P-47s, 7 pilots recovered. The loss rate of less than 1% per sortie is remarkable given the intensity of German anti-aircraft fire. Aircraft regularly return with damage that would destroy lighter fighters, multiple cannon hits, severed control cables, damaged engines, yet pilots consistently bring them home. Most significantly, the psychological effect on German ground forces is profound. Intercepted radio traffic indicates enemy troops refuse to move in daylight due to fear of P-47 attacks. This paralysis of German logistics and troop movements represents a strategic advantage beyond the physical damage. The German Wehrmacht was learning what the Luftwaffe had already discovered. The P-47 Thunderbolt didn't fight by conventional rules. It was too tough to kill reliably, too heavily armed to survive contact with, and present everywhere simultaneously. Feldwebel Klaus Brettschneider, a German anti-aircraft gunner in a post-war interview, described the difficulty of defending against P-47 attacks.
But the P-47 was something beyond that. It was flying artillery with the accuracy of a sniper. They attacked from unexpected directions, very low and very fast. Our 20mm guns couldn't track them effectively. By the time you had them in your sights, they were already past and climbing away. The 88mm guns were useless against such fast, low targets. Even when we hit them, they didn't go down. I personally saw a P-47 take 3 20mm shells and continue its attack run. It dropped its bombs accurately, fired its rockets, strafed our positions with those terrible machine guns, and then flew away trailing smoke. We reported it as destroyed. 3 days later, intelligence told us the same aircraft, identified by its nose art, was back in action. They were like demons, unkillable, unstoppable. The sound of those engines became a nightmare. Men who'd survived years of combat on the Eastern Front would panic when they heard that thunder approaching. As D-Day approached, P-47 units intensified their operations against German transportation infrastructure. The goal was to isolate the Normandy battlefield, preventing German reinforcements from reaching the invasion beaches once the assault began. Between April and June 1944, 9th Air Force P-47s flew over 50,000 ground attack sorties, destroying an estimated 4,000 locomotives, 12,000 railway cars, 9,000 trucks, and damaging or destroying over 200 bridges. The French rail network was systematically demolished. Roads were interdicted. Any German vehicle movement in daylight invited immediate and devastating air attack. The statistics were staggering, but they only told part of the story. The real impact was psychological. German troops learned that movement meant death, that concentration meant discovery, that daylight operations were suicide. The Wehrmacht, which had conquered most of Europe through mobile warfare and rapid maneuver, was being forced into static defensive positions by an aircraft that had been designed to intercept bombers at 30,000 feet.
8 aircraft. We were 12. We had altitude advantage. We thought we could fight through. They didn't engage in traditional combat. They simply rolled inverted and dove, building speed we couldn't match. Then, they pulled up behind us in perfect position and opened fire. 2 of our fighters went down in the first pass, just gone. No warning, no chance to evade. We broke formation and dove, trying to reach the cloud cover. 4 more fighters destroyed during the dive. The Americans followed us down, firing constantly. That sound, 8 guns per aircraft, multiple aircraft firing, it was like flying through a steel wall. I managed to reach clouds at 5,000 feet. When I emerged on the other side, I was alone. Of 12 aircraft that took off that morning, I was the only one to return. We never got close to the invasion fleet, never fired a shot at the ships. We were simply erased. Fischer's experience was repeated throughout D-Day. The Luftwaffe launched approximately 100 fighter sorties against the invasion force. Only a handful reached the actual beaches. German pilots faced P-47s at every altitude, in every sector, with no gaps in coverage and no chance to mass for effective attacks. The statistics from D-Day tell the story of complete air dominance. Invasion area sorties from the Luftwaffe, 100 to estimates. Estimated German aircraft shot down, 47. German pilots killed or captured, 34. P-47 losses over the beaches, 2, both to anti-aircraft fire, not enemy fighters. Allied ships damaged by German air attack, 0. Allied landing craft attacked by German aircraft, 0. The sky belonged entirely to the Allies. The Thunderbolts didn't just protect the invasion, they made German air opposition irrelevant. But the P-47's role didn't end with fighter protection. As the day progressed and the beaches were secured, Thunderbolt units shifted to ground attack missions, supporting the troops struggling through German defenses inland from the beaches. Captain Robert Johnson, now a 27 Victory Ace commanding a flight in the 61st Fighter Squadron, led one of the first ground attack missions in support of the troops at Omaha Beach. His flight of 4 P-47s was directed to a German strongpoint that was holding up the advance, a concrete bunker complex with interlocking fields of fire that was causing heavy casualties among American infantry. Johnson's attack approach was clinical. He positioned his flight at 5,000 feet, identified the target through breaks in the smoke, and calculated the attack angle to maximize the effectiveness of his ordnance while minimizing exposure to German anti-aircraft fire.
The explosions didn't destroy the concrete, it was too thick, but they stunned the defenders and created smoke that masked the follow-up attacks. Johnson's rockets followed, 10 HVARs streaking into the target area, their combined explosive force equivalent to a naval bombardment. Then his 8 machine guns opened fire as he pulled up from the attack, raking the German positions with armor-piercing incendiary rounds. Behind him, 3 more P-47s repeated the attack profile. 2,000 pounds of bombs, 40 rockets, and sustained machine gun fire concentrated on a single German strongpoint in less than 30 seconds. When the smoke cleared, the bunker complex was no longer a functioning defensive position. The American infantry advanced. This pattern repeated across Normandy throughout D-Day and the following weeks. P-47s operating as flying artillery, providing close air support with precision and devastating firepower. The German Wehrmacht, which had conquered Europe through combined arms tactics, was being systematically destroyed by an enemy that controlled the skies absolutely. By the end of June 1944, the Luftwaffe fighter force in France had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. The P-47s and other Allied fighters had achieved air supremacy so complete that German aircraft movements in daylight became suicidal. While the European theater captured most attention, P-47 Thunderbolts were simultaneously revolutionizing air combat in the Pacific. The 348th Fighter Group, operating from New Guinea under Colonel Neil Kirby, discovered that the Thunderbolt's characteristics were perfectly suited to the vast distances and harsh conditions of Pacific warfare. The Japanese, accustomed to fighting nimble but fragile American fighters like the P-40, were completely unprepared for the P-47. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, who survived the war with 64 victories, encountered Thunderbolts over New Guinea in late 1943. We called them monsters. Our 20mm cannon, which could destroy a Wildcat or P-40 with a few hits, seemed ineffective. I personally put dozens of rounds into one Thunderbolt and watched it continue fighting. When they fired back, their streams of heavy bullets tore aircraft apart. The Zero's maneuverability meant nothing when one burst from those 8 guns destroyed everything. Colonel Kirby proved the P-47's effectiveness dramatically on October 11, 1943, when he led 4 Thunderbolts against 40 Japanese aircraft over Wewak. Using pure energy tactics, diving attacks from altitude, firing devastating bursts, then climbing away before the Japanese could respond, Kirby personally shot down 6 enemy aircraft in a single mission, earning him the Medal of Honor. The P-47N, developed specifically for Pacific operations, featured increased fuel capacity with wet wings, holding 1,266 gallons total, extending range to 2,350 miles. These ultimate Thunderbolts would escort B-29s all the way to Japan, proving that the short-legged fighter of 1943 had evolved into a true long-range strategic weapon.
By late 1944, Germany had deployed the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. With a top speed of 540 miles per hour, the Me-262 should have been untouchable by propeller-driven fighters. German pilots believed they'd finally found an aircraft that could defeat American numerical superiority through technological supremacy. They were wrong. P-47 pilots discovered they could kill jets in 2 situations: during takeoff and landing, when jets were most vulnerable, and in high-speed dives from extreme altitude, where the Thunderbolt could briefly match jet speeds. On November 27, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group became one of the first pilots to shoot down an Me-262 with a P-47. Diving from 28,000 feet, Meyer's Thunderbolt reached speeds approaching 500 miles per hour, fast enough to intercept the jet in level flight. His combat report was matter-of-fact. Enemy aircraft disintegrated under fire. The concentrated fire of 8 .50 caliber guns proved more effective than anticipated against jet aircraft. Large pieces, including both engines, separated from fuselage. Pilot did not escape. By early 1945, specialized P-47M variants were deployed specifically to counter jets and V-1 flying bombs.
With water methanol injection boosting power to 2,800 horsepower and refined aerodynamics, these ultimate Thunderbolts could reach 470 miles per hour in level flight at 30,000 feet, fast enough to intercept even jets under certain conditions. Major George Bostwick, commanding the 63rd Fighter Squadron equipped with P-47Ms, shot down 2 Me-262s in March 1945. His tactical assessment was brutal. The jets are faster, but they can't turn and they can't take punishment. One good burst from our guns and they come apart like paper. We let them attack the bombers, wait for them to slow down, then kill them. The psychological impact on German jet fighters was profound. They'd been told their advanced aircraft would sweep the skies of American fighters. Instead, they discovered that technological advantage meant nothing when you couldn't survive long enough to use it. The ultimate demonstration of American industrial might came on January 1, 1945, during Operation Boden-Platte, the Luftwaffe's desperate final attempt to destroy Allied air power. Nearly 900 German fighters launched surprise attacks on Allied airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands. At Y-34 Airfield near Metz, home to the 365th Fighter Group's P-47s, the attack initially succeeded. German fighters destroyed 22 Thunderbolts on the ground. A captured German pilot, brought to the command post, pointed at the burning aircraft and taunted, "What do you think of that?" Major George Brookings' response became legendary. He pointed to the flight line, where ground crews were already pushing damaged aircraft aside. "By tomorrow, we'll have 40 new ones. How long will it take you to replace your pilots?"
The German pilot's smirk vanished. Within 48 hours, factory-fresh P-47s filled the flight line, flown in from depots in England. The Luftwaffe lost 271 aircraft and 213 pilots in Boden-Platte, losses they could never replace. The Americans lost 134 aircraft across all attacked airfields, all replaced within a week. The numbers told the story of inevitable defeat. P-47 production. Total built 15,683 aircraft. Peak production, 1 complete fighter every 63 minutes, 24 hours per day. Assembly required, 65,000 individual parts per aircraft. Manufacturing tolerance, thousandths of an inch on critical components. Workforce, mostly women who'd never seen an aircraft before 1942. Ammunition production. Monthly consumption, over 10 million rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. Lake City Arsenal alone, 30 million rounds per month. Precision, each cartridge manufactured to 1/10,000th inch tolerances. Reliability, near zero malfunction rate despite volume. Pilot training. Annual graduates 30,000 pilots by 1944. Training hours, 400+ hours before combat assignment. Advanced fighter time, 100+ hours in type before deployment. German equivalent by 1945, less than 100 hours total flight time. The contrast was stark. America was producing fighters faster than Germany could train pilots. Training pilots faster than Germany could replace losses, and improving quality while Germany's degraded. March 1945. Oberstleutnant Josef Pips Priller, the same pilot who'd mocked the P-47s as flying milk bottles in April 1943, was interviewed by German propaganda officials seeking content to boost morale. His statement, deemed too demoralizing for publication, revealed the complete transformation in German attitudes. The Thunderbolt is the best fighter bomber ever built. Its firepower is unprecedented. Weapons that never jam, never overheat, never run out of ammunition in normal combat. It carries bombs like a medium bomber, fires rockets like artillery, and fights like a fighter when needed. But beyond the machine is what it represents: unlimited American production. They lose 10, they build 20. We lose 1, it's gone forever. Their pilots arrive better trained than our instructors. They have fuel for training, ammunition for practice, spare parts for everything. We have nothing but courage. And courage without resources is just delayed defeat. We laughed at them in 1943. We're not laughing now. When you hear those guns, you know death has come calling. The sound haunts us, mechanical, precise, unstoppable. Like everything American, it's about overwhelming material superiority. They didn't beat us through better tactics or braver pilots. They buried us under an avalanche of steel and lead. Feldwebel Klaus Bletschneider, one of the last German pilots trained in 1945, flew exactly 1 combat mission before the war ended. His encounter with P-47s over Leipzig lasted 12 seconds. I saw them diving from above, 4 thunderbolts in perfect formation.
I tried to turn, but they were too fast. The leader fired from 500 meters. My aircraft shook like it was hit by sledgehammers. The engine exploded. The wings separated. I barely escaped. In the parachute, I watched them destroy my entire staffel. 6 fighters gone in under a minute. The sky rained burning aluminum and bodies. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe existed largely on paper. Fuel shortages grounded most aircraft. Experienced pilots were dead or captured. Airfields were cratered ruins. Final statistics. European theater. German aircraft destroyed in air combat, 3,752. German aircraft destroyed on ground, 3,315. Railway cars destroyed, 86,000. Locomotives destroyed, 9,000. Armored vehicles destroyed, 6,000. Trucks destroyed, 68,000. Pacific Theater. Japanese aircraft destroyed, 697 air, 150 ground. Vehicles destroyed, 1,500 plus. Ships and barges destroyed, countless. Combined operations. Total sorties, 213,873, 9th Air Force alone. Bombs dropped, 120,000 tons. Ammunition fired, 135 million rounds. Rockets launched, 60,000. Kill ratio, 4.6 to 1. Loss rate, lowest of any Allied fighter bomber. Epilogue. The Silence After Thunder. 1985, Phoenix, Arizona. A reunion of German and American fighter pilots, former enemies meeting in peace 40 years after the war's end. Generalleutnant Adolf Galland, former commander of the Luftwaffe fighter arm, was asked about the P-47. His response, recorded on video, captured the complete transformation. We made a terrible mistake in 1943. We saw this big, heavy fighter and laughed. The Americans don't understand air combat. They built a bomber and called it a fighter. We were the ones who didn't understand. The Americans didn't try to build a European fighter. They built an American one, designed around production, firepower, and survivability. They understood that in a war of attrition, the plane that could take punishment and deliver devastating firepower would win. They were right. The first time I flew a captured P-47 after the war, I understood everything. The power was incredible. It climbed like it was falling upward. The cockpit was comfortable, the visibility excellent, the controls precise. It was a pilot's aircraft wrapped in armor. But what really impressed me was realizing America built over 15,000 of these complex machines while fighting a 2-ocean war. Each one required an engine more complex than anything Germany produced. yet they built them faster than we could build simple fighters. That's when I knew we never had a chance. Those guns, we called them Roosevelt's piano because of the sound they made. Once you heard that sound, you never forgot it. Many of my friends heard it for the last time. The P-47 didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe, it destroyed it. At the United States Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, a restored P-47D sits among other legendary fighters. Below the display is a quote from an unnamed German pilot taken from a 1945 interrogation report. "We laughed when we first saw them, fat, ugly American fighters that couldn't turn, couldn't climb, couldn't fight.
We stopped laughing when we realized they didn't need to turn or climb. They just pointed those guns at you and you ceased to exist. The laughter died with our comrades." The P-47 Thunderbolt entered combat as an object of derision and ended the war as an instrument of annihilation. In between, 8 synchronized Browning machine guns rewrote the rules of aerial warfare and buried the Luftwaffe under an avalanche of lead. German pilots had laughed at the ungainly American fighter in April 1943. By May 1945, there were no German pilots left to laugh. The thunder had spoken, and the sky belonged to America. Final reflection: the weapon that changed everything. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt represents more than just an aircraft. It represents the application of American industrial philosophy to warfare. Brute force engineering, backed by unlimited resources and refined through continuous improvement. Every component was overbuilt. The wing spars could support loads 3 times the aircraft's weight. The engine mount could withstand 12 G-forces. The control cables were doubled throughout. The ammunition feed system alone was a marvel. 8 separate boxes, electric boost motors, individual heating, automatic backup systems. Even after the war, some German veterans maintained that the P-47 won through quantity, not quality. The combat records tell a different story. In engagements where numbers were equal, P-47s consistently prevailed. The heavy machine gun armament, dismissed as inferior to cannon, proved more effective in actual combat. Analysis of gun camera footage revealed why. Cannon shells, while individually more destructive, required precise aim and had limited ammunition. The P-47's 8 guns created a probability cloud of bullets that guaranteed hits even with imperfect aim. At typical engagement ranges, a 2-second burst put at least 20 rounds into a fighter-sized target, enough to ensure destruction. The P-47 Thunderbolt remains the heaviest single-engine piston fighter ever mass-produced. Its empty weight exceeded the gross weight of some twin-engine fighters. Its engine produced more power than entire bomber formations from the previous war. Its weapons delivered more firepower than a squad of infantry. Yet it was built by the thousands, flown by kids barely out of high school, and maintained under combat conditions by mechanics who learned their trade in weeks. We stopped laughing when we realized they didn't need to turn or climb. They just pointed those guns at you and you ceased to exist. The laughter died with our comrades. The P-47 Thunderbolt entered combat as an object of derision and ended the war as an instrument of annihilation. In between, 8 synchronized Browning machine guns rewrote the rules of aerial warfare and buried the Luftwaffe under an avalanche of lead. German pilots had laughed at the ungainly American fighter in April 1943. By May 1945, there were no German pilots left to laugh. The thunder had spoken, and the sky belonged to America. Final reflection: the weapon that changed everything. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt represents more than just an aircraft.
It represents the application of American industrial philosophy to warfare, brute force engineering, backed by unlimited resources and refined through continuous improvement. Every component was overbuilt. The wing spars could support loads 3 times the aircraft's weight. The engine mount could withstand 12 G-forces. The control cables were doubled throughout. The ammunition feed system alone was a marvel. 8 separate boxes, electric boost motors, individual heating, automatic backup systems. Even after the war, some German veterans maintained that the P-47 won through quantity, not quality. The combat records tell a different story. In engagements where numbers were equal, P-47s consistently prevailed. The heavy machine gun armament, dismissed as inferior to cannon, proved more effective in actual combat. Analysis of gun camera footage revealed why. Cannon shells, while individually more destructive, required precise aim and had limited ammunition. The P-47's 8 guns created a probability cloud of bullets that guaranteed hits, even with imperfect aim. At typical engagement ranges, a 2-second burst put at least 20 rounds into a fighter-sized target, enough to ensure destruction. The P-47 Thunderbolt remains the heaviest single-engine piston fighter ever mass-produced. Its empty weight exceeded the gross weight of some twin-engine fighters. Its engine produced more power than entire bomber formations from the previous war. Its weapons delivered more firepower than a squad of infantry. Yet it was built by the thousands, flown by kids barely out of high school, and maintained under combat conditions by mechanics who learned their trade in weeks. The transformation of German opinion from mockery to terror took less than 2 years. In that time, the flying milk bottle became the most feared aircraft in the Luftwaffe's experience. Veterans who had faced Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Soviet Yaks without flinching spoke of P-47s in hushed tones decades after the war. The lesson wasn't about aircraft design. It was about industrial warfare, about systems, about the integration of production, training, logistics, and tactics into a coherent whole that could be scaled infinitely. Germany built excellent fighters, flown by brave pilots using sophisticated tactics.
They must be drunk on their own whiskey to think these things can fight. The shapes resolved into clarity as they climbed closer. Hermichen had studied intelligence photos, had attended briefings about the new American fighter entering European combat. But seeing them in person triggered something between disbelief and genuine amusement. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Each one looked like someone had taken a normal fighter aircraft and inflated it to twice its proper size. Massive, barrel-shaped fuselages, bulbous cowlings housing radial engines that seemed designed for bombers, not fighters, wings that appeared comically small for those enormous bodies, and those canopies, huge greenhouse affairs that made the pilots look like they were sitting in flying observatories rather than combat aircraft. "They're beautiful," his wingman transmitted, voice dripping with sarcasm, like flying milk bottles, or perhaps pregnant cows with wings. The German formation, 12 Focke-Wulf 190s of EE/JG-26, some of the finest fighters and pilots in the Luftwaffe, positioned themselves above and behind the climbing Americans. This would be a textbook bounce. Dive from superior altitude, use gravity and engine power to build devastating speed, fire a burst into the lumbering targets, then zoom back to altitude before the enemy could react. Simple, clean, deadly.
Hermichen had executed this maneuver hundreds of times. He'd done it against nimble Spitfires and swift Soviet Yaks. These fat American fighters wouldn't stand a chance. Below them, 16 P-47C Thunderbolts of the 4th Fighter Group clawed for altitude. Their 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engines straining against the 13,000-pound weight of each aircraft, more than 7 tons of metal, fuel, ammunition, and human determination, fighting gravity at the very edge of the stratosphere. To understand the miracle that was about to unfold, you need to understand what those American pilots were facing. Every one of them was a novice in European combat. The 4th Fighter Group had only recently transitioned from British Spitfires to the massive Thunderbolts. Many had logged less than 50 hours in the new type. They'd never fired their guns in anger, never tested their massive machines against the Luftwaffe's veterans. And now they faced the best fighter unit in the German Air Force. The mathematics seemed simple. German experience versus American inexperience. German agility versus American bulk. The sleek, nimble Focke-Wulf 190 versus the corpulent P-47 Thunderbolt. This should have been a massacre. What Franz Hermichen didn't know, what none of the German pilots diving to attack could have imagined, was that they were witnessing the arrival of a weapon that would systematically destroy the Luftwaffe's fighter arm over the next 24 months. Those flying milk bottles carried in their broad wings the mathematics of industrial annihilation. 8 Browning M2 50 caliber heavy machine guns, 3,400 rounds of ammunition, a combined rate of fire exceeding 6,000 rounds per minute, and enough concentrated firepower to saw a medium bomber in half in less than 3 seconds.
But weapons alone don't win wars. What would truly terrorize the Luftwaffe was the realization that America could produce these complex, powerful machines faster than Germany could train pilots to replace those lost in combat. The transformation that would occur over the next 18 months, from April 1943 to October 1944, represents one of the most dramatic reversals in military aviation history. German laughter would turn to grudging respect, then to genuine fear, and finally to something approaching terror, as pilots who'd survived combat against every Allied fighter type discovered that the P-47 Thunderbolt didn't fight by anyone's existing rules. This is the story of how that transformation happened, how industrial logic defeated tactical brilliance, how quantity and quality merged into overwhelming superiority, and how the sound of 8 synchronized Browning machine guns became the last thing hundreds of Luftwaffe pilots ever heard. Chapter 1. Genesis of a Giant. The P-47 Thunderbolt didn't emerge from careful, measured planning. It was born from panic. June 1940. France was collapsing under the Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg. German fighters, sleek Messerschmitt Bf-109s and the newly introduced Focke-Wulf 190s were sweeping the skies of Allied opposition. In Washington, military planners watched with growing horror as Europe burned and American fighter designs suddenly seemed hopelessly obsolete. Alexander Kartveli sat in his Republic Aviation office in Farmingdale, Long Island, staring at the specifications the U.S. Army Air Corps had just delivered. A Georgian immigrant who'd fled the Russian Revolution, Kartveli had already designed several successful aircraft for Republic, but this new requirement seemed almost impossible. The Army wanted a high-altitude interceptor capable of matching, no exceeding, anything the Luftwaffe could field.
It needed to operate effectively above 30,000 feet, where the air was so thin conventional fighters gasped for power. It needed to be faster than anything Germany had. It needed to be tougher, better armed, and capable of serving as both fighter and fighter-bomber. Oh, and they needed it yesterday. Cardvelli's team gathered around the drawing boards in Republic's engineering department. The chief designer lit his trademark cigar and studied the impossible list of requirements. "Gentlemen," he announced in his thick Georgian accent, "we are going to build a dinosaur, but it will be a dinosaur with very good proportions." What emerged from those frantic design sessions would shock everyone who saw it. The XP-47B prototype rolled out of the Farmingdale factory in May 1941, and test pilots approaching it for the first time invariably stopped dead in their tracks. At 9,900 pounds empty weight, it weighed 65% more than its predecessor, the P-43 Lancer. It was massive, bulbous. It looked like someone had crossed a fighter with a light bomber and forgotten which was which. The most distinctive feature, and the source of much early ridicule, was the enormous fuselage.
It wasn't sleek like the P-51 Mustang or compact like the Spitfire. It was a barrel, a flying beer keg. Engineers had designed it around the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine and the complex turbo supercharger system that would give the aircraft its stratospheric performance. That turbo supercharger represented the key to the P-47's entire existence. While most fighters used mechanical superchargers that bled power from the engine, the Thunderbolt system used exhaust gases to drive a turbine that compressed incoming air before feeding it to the engine. This meant the R2800 could maintain sea-level power output at altitudes where other fighters were suffocating. But the system required extensive ducting, piping, and intercoolers. All of that plumbing had to go somewhere. Hence the pregnant appearance, the bulging belly, the overall impression of a fighter that had eaten too well and was now paying the price. Test pilot Lowry Brabham climbed into the cockpit for the first flight on May 6, 1941. His initial reaction, recorded in the flight test report, "This airplane looks like it was designed by a committee that couldn't agree on anything except making it bigger." Then he started the engine. The R2800 Double Wasp was unlike any fighter engine in American inventory. 18 cylinders, arranged in 2 rows, producing 2,000 horsepower, more power than entire bomber formations from World War I. When Brabham pushed the throttle forward for takeoff, the Thunderbolt didn't just accelerate, it lunged. The torque tried to roll the aircraft right, forcing Brabham to apply hard left rudder just to keep the nose straight. At 60 knots, he pulled back on the stick. The nose rose. At 90 knots, the massive fighter broke free from the runway and clawed skyward with an eagerness that seemed to contradict everything about its appearance. "It flies," Brabham transmitted to the tower, genuine surprise evident in his voice. "It actually flies, and it flies well." The climb to 15,000 feet was unremarkable, but as Brabham continued upward toward 25,000 feet, altitude where conventional fighters began losing performance rapidly, something remarkable happened. The Thunderbolt didn't slow. If anything, it seemed to get stronger. At 30,000 feet, where most fighters wheezed and struggled, the P-47 was still pulling strongly. The turbo supercharger was doing its job, feeding the engine compressed air that compensated for the thin atmosphere. Brabham leveled off at 35,000 feet, higher than any American fighter had ever operated routinely, and the Thunderbolt cruised there as comfortably as if it were at sea level. Then came the dive test. Brabham rolled the massive fighter inverted and pulled the nose down. The Thunderbolt fell like a thrown anvil, its 7-ton mass converting altitude into kinetic energy with terrifying efficiency. The airspeed indicator wound clockwise, 300 miles per hour, 350, 400,
450 miles per hour. At 500 miles per hour, strange things began happening.
The controls stiffened dramatically. The aircraft began to buffet and shake. The stick felt like it was set in concrete. Brabham couldn't move it more than an inch in any direction. He'd discovered compressibility, the effect that occurred as the aircraft approached the speed of sound. At those velocities, shock waves began forming on the wings and control surfaces, disrupting airflow and freezing the controls. Brabham hauled back on the throttle and the stick simultaneously, fighting the aircraft's dive. Slowly, reluctantly, the Thunderbolt began to level off. The airspeed bled off. The buffeting ceased. The controls became responsive again. He'd just survived one of aviation's most dangerous phenomena. And he'd done it in an aircraft that could reach speeds no other fighter in the world could achieve. The flight test report concluded, "Subject aircraft demonstrates exceptional high-altitude performance and dive speed unprecedented in American fighters. Weight and size present handling challenges, but power output compensates. Recommended for production with modifications to control forces." But not everyone was convinced. When the first production P-47Bs began arriving at training units in late 1942, pilots viewed them with open skepticism. Fighter pilots pride themselves on flying nimble, responsive aircraft. The Thunderbolt was neither nimble nor, at first glance, responsive. Major Hubert "Hub" Zemke took command of the 56th Fighter Group at Bridgeport, Connecticut in September 1942. His mission? Train American pilots to take the P-47 into combat against the Luftwaffe. A tough, no-nonsense leader who'd observed German tactics in the Soviet Union, Zemke took one look at the Thunderbolt and reportedly said, "They expect us to fight in this?" What followed was a training period that would become legendary for all the wrong reasons. Between September 1942 and January 1943, just 4 months, the 56th Fighter Group lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft to training accidents. 18 men dead before they ever saw combat. The Thunderbolt was killing more Americans than the Germans would in the first months of operations. The problems were numerous and often fatal. The massive torque from that enormous engine caused the aircraft to ground loop violently on landing if pilots weren't careful with the rudder. The tendency to roll right on takeoff caught inexperienced pilots off guard, sometimes with fatal results. And in dives, the compressibility issue that Brabham had discovered could trap unwary pilots in uncontrollable descents that ended in impact with the ground. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Landry, observing the training program for Army Air Force's headquarters, filed a report suggesting that perhaps the P-47 wasn't suitable for combat operations. The aircraft displays characteristics that may prove insurmountable for average pilots, his report stated. Consideration should be given to canceling production and focusing resources on proven designs.
Hub Zemke read that report and threw it in the trash. "The airplane isn't the problem," he told his pilots at a group meeting after yet another fatal crash. "We are. We're trying to fly it like it's a P-40 or a Spitfire. It's not. It's something entirely new, and we need to learn to fly it on its terms, not ours." The pilots who survived the brutal training period, and there were many who didn't, began to discover something extraordinary. Once you learned to respect the Thunderbolt's mass and power, once you stopped trying to dogfight with it and started using its strengths, it became a weapon unlike anything in the sky. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma who'd grown up working on tractors and farm machinery, understood the P-47 intuitively in ways that more classically trained pilots didn't. After his first successful solo flight, he tried to explain it to his squadron mates. "It's not a fighter," Johnson said. "Not the way we think of fighters. It's a flying tank with a very big gun. You don't dance with it, you point it at the target and pull the trigger. All that weight, all that power, it's not a bug, it's a feature. You just have to learn to use it." The armament was indeed impressive. 8 M2 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc without hitting the blades. Each gun loaded with 425 rounds of mixed ammunition, armor-piercing incendiary tracer, and standard ball rounds in carefully designed patterns. Combined weight of fire, 3,400 rounds total. Rate of fire, over 100 rounds per second when all 8 guns fired simultaneously. Effective range, 400 yards, with convergence typically set at 300 yards, the distance where all 8 guns' trajectories intersected. At that convergence point, anything in the line of fire faced roughly 100 half-inch projectiles per second, each one traveling at 2,900 feet per second, each one carrying enough kinetic energy to penetrate aircraft armor, sever control cables, puncture fuel tanks, and shatter engines. The first pilots to fire the guns in training were shocked by the violence of it. Unlike rifle-caliber machine guns that chattered and vibrated, or a 20mm cannon that fired with measured thumps, the 8 Brownings created a sound unlike anything in military aviation. A continuous, thunderous roar that shook the entire aircraft. A wall of noise that could be heard from miles away. German intelligence officers, analyzing reports from Luftwaffe pilots who encountered the early P-47s, noted something interesting. Even in engagements where the Americans were defeated, and there were many in those first months, German pilots reported being shaken by the sound and fury of the Thunderbolt's armament when it did connect. "The sound is psychological," one intelligence report noted. "It creates the impression of overwhelming firepower, even when accuracy is poor. This may prove problematic if American pilots improve their gunnery." They would improve, and when they did, that sound would become the last thing hundreds of Luftwaffe pilots ever heard. By April 1943, the 4th and 56th Fighter Groups were as ready as training could make them. They loaded aboard ships bound for England, taking with them their massive Thunderbolts and a burning desire to prove that American fighters could match the Luftwaffe's best. What they couldn't have known, what no one could have predicted, was that they were carrying with them the weapon that would break the back of German fighter aviation. Not through superior agility, not through better climb rate or turn performance, but through a combination of industrial might, concentrated firepower, and a fundamental shift in how air combat would be waged. The transformation was about to begin, and it would start with German laughter. April 8, 1943. The air over Caen, France was crystalline and cold at 27,000 feet, perfect hunting weather for the wolves of Jagdgeschwader 26. Franz Hermiken waggled his wings, signaling his formation of 12 Focke-Wulf 190s to prepare for attack. Below and ahead, the American formation climbed ponderously upward, each P-47 trailing thin contrails in the frigid stratospheric air. This would be the first major combat test of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt against Germany's finest, and from where Hermiken sat, it looked like a slaughter. "All Fuchs aircraft," he transmitted using his unit's call sign. "Prepare to attack. Remember, they're big, slow, and fat. Bounce from above, single pass, then reform at altitude. Don't try to turn with them, you won't need to." Laughter crackled across the radio frequency. Someone transmitted, "Don't try to turn with them,
These things probably can't turn at all. Major Donald Blakesley, commanding the 335th Fighter Squadron of the American 4th Fighter Group, had already spotted the German formation above. A former Eagle Squadron pilot who had flown Spitfires with the RAF before transferring to the American forces, Blakesley understood what most of his pilots didn't yet grasp. In the P-47, survival meant abandoning every instinct trained into fighter pilots. Keyworth Squadron, this is Keyworth Leader. Bandits high at 2 o'clock. Maintain formation. Do not, I repeat, do not attempt to engage in turning combat. If they bounce us, dive for speed and use your altitude advantage to zoom back up. Remember your training. But training and combat were two different things entirely. Several of his younger pilots had never fired their guns at anything that could shoot back. Most had less than 100 hours in the P-47, and now they were about to face pilots who'd been in continuous combat since 1939. The German formation rolled over into their attack dive. 12 Focke-Wulf 190s, each one a masterpiece of German engineering, lightweight, nimble, heavily armed with 20mm cannon and 13mm machine guns. Painted in camouflage schemes of gray and green, each one marked with the yellow nose and fuselage band that identified Jagdgeschwader 26. Hermitian centered his gun sight on the rearmost P-47 in the American formation. The reticle danced slightly as he adjusted for the relative motion. His finger tensed on the trigger. Range, 400 meters, 300, 200. He squeezed the trigger. The Focke-Wulf shuddered as its armament fired. 2 20mm MG-151 cannon in the wing roots and 2 13mm MG-131 machine guns in the cowling, all firing in carefully timed bursts to conserve ammunition. Hermitian saw his cannon shells exploding around the American fighter. Strikes, definite strikes on the wing and fuselage. He expected to see pieces flying off, expected the P-47 to roll over and dive, trailing smoke and flame. Instead, the Thunderbolt seemed to shrug off the hits. It wallowed slightly, pilot probably startled by the impact, but continued flying straight and level. No fire, no visible damage, just continuing. "What?" Hermitian transmitted incredulously. "I hit him squarely." He didn't have time for further analysis. The rest of his formation was already making their passes, and he needed to zoom back to altitude before the Americans could organize a response. He pulled hard on the stick, using the energy from his dive to climb back above the American formation. Below, the P-47 formation was in chaos. Several of the American pilots, seeing tracers flash past their canopies, had broken formation and dove away, exactly the wrong response. In a dive, the P-47 was untouchable, but by scattering, they'd abandoned the mutual protection of formation flying. 2 more Germans made firing passes. One of them, an experienced ace named Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, younger brother of the famous Adolf Galland, managed to get his entire ammunition load into a diving P-47. He watched, fascinated and horrified, as his cannon shells exploded across the American fighter's broad back. The P-47 pitched up violently from the impacts, nearly stalling. Smoke streamed from its engine. For a moment, Galland thought he had his kill. Then the smoke stopped. The American pilot recovered from the near stall, pushed the nose down, and the Thunderbolt accelerated in a dive so steep and so fast that Galland couldn't follow. He tried, pushing his Focke-Wulf to its limits, but the massive American fighter simply walked away from him. "Incredible," Galland transmitted. "He's diving at over 700 kilometers per hour. I cannot follow." Hermitian rallied his formation at 30,000 feet and assessed the situation. They'd made multiple firing passes. They'd scored numerous hits, and they'd achieved nothing. 0 American fighters shot down. 0 falling in flames or trailing smoke toward the ground. This wasn't how it was supposed to work. When you hit a Spitfire with 20mm cannon fire, it broke apart. When you hit a Soviet Yak with machine gun fire, it burned. But these American monsters just absorbed the punishment and kept flying. "Reform on me," Hermitian ordered. "We'll try again. This time, longer firing passes."
But before they could position for another attack, something happened that would fundamentally change German perceptions of the P-47 Thunderbolt. One of the American fighters, a P-47 piloted by Lieutenant William Grover of the 62nd Fighter Squadron, had managed to climb back to 28,000 feet after diving away from the initial bounce. Unlike his squadron mates who'd scattered across the sky, Grover had remembered his training. He used his dive to build speed, then converted that speed back to altitude in a zoom climb that put him nearly even with the German formation. And now, for the first time in this engagement, a P-47 had a positional advantage. Grover was behind and slightly above 3 Focke-Wulfs that were positioning to dive on another group of Thunderbolts. The Germans hadn't seen him. They were focused on their targets below, confident in their superiority, certain that the fat American fighters posed no real threat. Grover rolled his P-47 into a shallow dive, using gravity to build just enough speed to close the range. His gun sight settled on the leftmost German fighter. Range, 500 yards, 400, 350. At 300 yards, he squeezed the trigger. 8 M2 Browning machine guns opened fire simultaneously. The Thunderbolt shuddered from the recoil, nearly a ton of force pushing against the airframe. Tracer rounds arced out, glowing orange-red in the thin air. The convergence zone of all 8 guns intersected directly in the path of the German fighter. The effect was catastrophic. The Focke-Wulf 190 seemed to disintegrate. Not just break apart, disintegrate. The tail section separated cleanly. The left wing crumpled and folded back. The cockpit area simply vanished in a cloud of aluminum fragments and debris. And all of this happened in approximately 1.5 seconds. The German pilot never had a chance to react, never had time to feel fear or pain. One moment he was positioning for attack. The next moment he ceased to exist. His aircraft transformed into falling wreckage by 100 half-inch projectiles impacting nearly simultaneously. Hermitian saw it from 1,000 feet away, watched one of his pilots, a good man, a veteran of 2 years of combat, simply come apart in mid-air. He stared in shock at the expanding debris cloud, trying to process what he'd just witnessed. "Brake!" he screamed into his radio. "Brake! They're armed like bombers!" But it was too late for the second German fighter. Grover had already shifted his aim, traversing smoothly to the next target. Another 2-second burst, another Focke-Wulf transformed into metal confetti, raining toward the French countryside below. The third German pilot reacted quickly enough to save his life. He rolled inverted and dove, using every bit of his aircraft's performance to escape. Behind him, Grover's tracers clawed at the sky where he'd been moments before. The American pilot tried to follow, but the diving Focke-Wulf was already pulling away. The P-47 might be fast in a dive, but the lighter German fighter could reverse and climb more quickly, making pursuit difficult. Grover pulled out of his dive and climbed back to altitude, adrenaline making his hand shake on the stick. He'd just gotten his first 2 aerial victories, and he'd learned something that would prove crucial in the months ahead. When the P-47's guns hit, nothing survived. The engagement lasted another 10 minutes. The Germans made 2 more attack passes, scoring additional hits on several P-47s, but achieving no kills. The Americans, scattered and disorganized, managed only 1 more firing pass that resulted in damage but no confirmed destruction. When the formation separated and headed for home, the Germans to their bases in France,
the Americans to England. Both sides were subdued. The American pilots landed and gathered in the debriefing room at their base near Debden. Several aircraft had damage. One P-47 had taken 3 20mm cannon hits and over 30 machine gun strikes. The pilot had landed safely. The ground crew was already repairing it for the next day's mission. "Well," Blakesley said to his squadron, "that could have gone better, but you're all alive, and we got 2 confirmed kills. Against Jagdschwader 26, that's not bad for a first mission." Lieutenant Grover raised his hand tentatively. "Sir, those guns, when I hit them, they just exploded. I've never seen anything like it." Blakesley nodded. "That's the firepower advantage we have. 850s firing together put out more bullets per second than anything the Germans have. You just have to get into position to use them. That's the hard part. But when you do," he made an explosive gesture with his hands. Across the English Channel, a very different conversation was taking place. Franz Hermeken filed his combat report with growing unease. 2 aircraft lost, 7 with various degrees of battle damage, 0 confirmed kills against the Americans. The mathematics of the engagement were disturbing. "The new American fighter is heavier and slower than anticipated. However, it demonstrates exceptional structural strength. Multiple cannon and machine gun strikes failed to achieve decisive damage. When the American pilots did achieve firing position, their concentrated machine gun armament proved extremely effective. 2 of our aircraft were destroyed so quickly that neither pilot had opportunity to evade or bail out." He paused and then added a personal note that wouldn't appear in the official record. "These aircraft are not easy targets. Any pilot treating them as such will not live long." The commander of Jujo Group 2, 26, Major Joseph Pips Priller, read Hermeken's report with interest. Priller was one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced pilots, a veteran of Poland, France, Britain, and Russia. He'd seen every type of Allied fighter in combat, and he recognized something in Hermeken's report that concerned him. "The Americans are learning," Priller said to his operations officer. "Right now, they're making mistakes, breaking formation, diving away when they should climb, not using their advantages."
But they'll learn, and when they do, with those guns and that structural strength, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. April 8, 1943, marked the beginning of a transformation that would take 18 months to complete. But the seeds were sown that day over France. German pilots had learned that the P-47 could absorb punishment that would destroy any other fighter. American pilots had learned that their massive guns could tear apart German aircraft when they could bring them to bear. What neither side yet understood was how this equation would evolve, how American tactics would improve, how P-47 performance would increase with new variants, and how the mathematics of attrition, America's ability to replace losses versus Germany's inability to do the same, would ultimately determine the outcome. The battle for air superiority over Europe had truly begun, and the fat American fighters were about to stop being jokes and start being nightmares. Chapter 3. The Day a Thunderbolt Refused to Die. June 26, 1943. The mission had been routine as flying through hostile airspace at 27,000 feet could ever be. 48 P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group were returning from escort duty, the bombers they'd protected safely on their way back to England. The American pilots were relaxed, joking on the radio, already thinking about the debriefing and the evening meal. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson flew in the rear of the formation, a position he'd been assigned as one of the newer pilots in the 61st Fighter Squadron. At 22 years old, the Oklahoma farm boy had been in combat for only 6 weeks. He'd scored his first victory,
a Focke-Wulf 190 destroyed just 10 days earlier. He was confident but not cocky, skilled but aware of how much he still had to learn, which is why he never saw them coming. 16 Focke-Wulf 190s of Jagdgeschwader 26 dove from the sun, led by Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland. The German formation had been lurking at 32,000 feet, waiting for this exact moment when the American fighters would be heading home, fuel low, guards down. The first indication Johnson had of trouble was when cannon shells began exploding around his aircraft. Not near it, not close to it, around it, impacting the wings, the fuselage, the engine cowling.
Johnson's aircraft had absorbed 21 20mm cannon shell hits and over 100 13mm machine gun strikes in approximately 8 seconds of concentrated fire from multiple German fighters. The mathematics of destruction were overwhelming. Each 20mm shell contained roughly 20 grams of high explosive. Total explosive force over 400 grams, nearly a pound of TNT detonating across his aircraft. The machine gun rounds added another dimension of devastation, each one capable of severing control cables, puncturing fuel tanks, or shattering structural members. By every calculation, every precedent, every previous example of combat damage, Johnson's P-47 should have disintegrated. It should have come apart in midair, raining wreckage across the French countryside below. It didn't. Johnson's training kicked in through the shock and pain. Shrapnel had torn into his nose and left leg. He could feel blood soaking through his flight suit, but couldn't spare attention to assess the wounds. His first priority was getting out of the dying aircraft. He reached for the canopy release, pulled hard. Nothing happened. He pulled again, harder. The canopy didn't budge. A 20mm shell had exploded in the canopy track mechanism, welding the metal framework into a solid mass. The emergency jettison system was dead, severed by the same shell that had shattered the plexiglass. He was trapped in a burning, dying aircraft at 27,000 feet with no way out. Most pilots would have panicked, would have beaten uselessly at the jammed canopy until the aircraft spun out of control and they died in the subsequent crash. Johnson, drawing on the same calm practicality that had made him successful on his family's Oklahoma farm, forced himself to think. If he couldn't get out, he had to fly at home, somehow, against every odd imaginable. The control stick responded to his inputs, though the aircraft wallowed sickeningly. The engine was still running, badly, shaking the entire airframe with violent vibrations, but running. He couldn't see forward through the oil-covered windscreen, couldn't see much of anything through the smoke and hydraulic fluid filling the cockpit. But the compass still worked, and the compass pointed toward England. Johnson pointed the nose of his shattered P-47 northwest and prayed. Behind him, the German formation was already reforming, preparing to resume their hunt for other American fighters. They'd seen Johnson's aircraft absorb catastrophic damage. They assumed, reasonably, that he was dead or would be within the next few minutes. What happened next would become one of the most extraordinary incidents in aviation combat history. A lone Focke-Wulf 190 from the second section of JG-26, flown by an unknown pilot whose identity has never been definitively established, spotted Johnson's crippled P-47 limping toward the English Channel. The German pilot saw an easy kill, a mortally wounded aircraft barely maintaining altitude, smoke trailing from its damaged engine, clearly unable to defend itself.
He positioned his fighter 200 yards behind Johnson's P-47 and opened fire with his complete armament, 2 20mm MG-151 cannon and 2 13mm MG-131 machine guns. Johnson, unable to evade, unable even to see his attacker through the oil-covered canopy, could only huddle behind his seat armor and feel each impact transmitted through the airframe. The cannon shells that hit, and several did, exploded with shattering force. One detonated inches from Johnson's head, the blast wave stunning him even through his leather helmet. Another hit the armor plate behind his seat, the steel absorbing the explosive force that would have severed his spine. The German pilot exhausted his 20mm ammunition. He'd put every cannon shell into the P-47. The American fighter should have been a falling torch by now, should have been spinning toward the ground in pieces. Instead, impossibly, it continued flying, wallowing, trailing smoke, barely maintaining altitude, but flying. The German pilot pulled alongside to verify the kill, to confirm that the American pilot was dead or dying. He pulled so close that Johnson, peering through the smoke and oil smearing his canopy, could see the German pilot's face clearly. Young, blonde, expression shifting through a range of emotions in seconds. Confidence, confusion, something approaching fear. The German was staring at what should have been wreckage, but was still somehow an aircraft. At an American pilot who should have been dead, but was still flying. At something that violated every understanding of how much punishment an aircraft could absorb. The Focke-Wulf pilot repositioned his aircraft behind the P-47 and emptied his remaining 13mm machine gun ammunition into Johnson's fighter. Hundreds of rounds, each one striking home, tearing into aluminum skin, shattering systems, puncturing hydraulic lines, severing cables. The Thunderbolt shuddered under the impacts. Pieces flew off, a section of cowling, part of the tail assembly, fragments of wing skin, but it continued flying. The German pilot pulled alongside again. Johnson could see him clearly now, could watch as the German pilot shook his head in what appeared to be disbelief or amazement. The German raised his hand in what might have been a salute, respect for a dead man flying, perhaps, or acknowledgement of something beyond understanding. Then the Focke-Wulf peeled away and dove toward its base in France, out of ammunition, out of explanations, leaving behind an American fighter that should not, could not, by any law of physics or precedent of combat, still be in the air. Johnson flew on. The English Channel passed beneath his crippled P-47. He couldn't see it through the oil-covered windscreen, but he knew from his compass heading that he'd crossed from French to English airspace. The engine was barely running now, each revolution sounding like it might be the last. The aircraft was losing altitude steadily, dropping 200 feet per minute despite his best efforts to maintain level flight.
He made it to the English coast, made it past the coastal defenses, made it to the emergency airfield at Monston, which kept a landing strip clear specifically for damaged aircraft that couldn't make it to their home bases. Johnson lowered his landing gear manually. The hydraulic system was completely dead. He had no flaps, no functioning instruments, no forward visibility. He lined up on the runway by looking out the side of his shattered canopy, judging his approach by feel and experience and desperation. The P-47 touched down hard, bounced, touched down again. The brakes were partially functional, enough to slow the aircraft, but not enough to stop it quickly. Johnson stood on the brake pedals, feeling the massive fighter slowly bleeding off speed as it rolled down the runway. The engine quit completely as the aircraft finally rolled to a stop. The sudden silence, after hours of that tortured radial engine shaking itself apart, was stunning. Johnson sat in the cockpit for a long moment, unable to quite believe he was alive, on the ground, in England.
Ground crew from the Manston emergency team were already running toward his aircraft. When they got close enough to see the damage, several of them stopped dead in their tracks. The crew chief was a veteran sergeant who'd seen hundreds of shot-up aircraft in his career. He walked slowly around Johnson's P-47, mouth opening and closing silently as he assessed the damage. When he reached the tail, he called over his shoulder to his crew, "Get the photographer. They're never going to believe this." They started counting bullet holes, stopped at 200 when they realized they'd barely covered half the aircraft. The final estimate would exceed 400 distinct impacts, 20mm cannon shells, 13mm machine gun rounds, and 7.92mm strikes from the initial bounce. The right wing had a section of skin completely missing, exposing the internal structure. 3 of the 4 main longerons, the structural backbone running the length of the fuselage, were shot through or severely damaged. One 20mm shell had exploded against the armor plate behind Johnson's seat, the blast pattern clearly visible in the distorted steel. Another had detonated in the canopy frame, which explained why he couldn't jettison it. The engine had taken at least 5 20mm hits and dozens of machine gun strikes. Cylinder heads were cracked, the cowling was gone, oil lines were severed. By any reasonable standard, the engine should have seized completely within minutes of the first hit. It had run for 40 minutes. The crew chief helped Johnson out of the cockpit. The lieutenant's face was covered in blood from the shrapnel wounds and hydraulic fluid. His flight suit was soaked with oil, hydraulic fluid, and his own blood. He could barely walk. The leg wound was worse than he'd realized in the heat of combat. "How?" the crew chief asked, gesturing at the devastated aircraft. "How did you fly this home? How did this thing not break apart?"
Johnson looked back at his P-47, really seeing the damage for the first time now that he was safely on the ground. He started laughing, partly from relief, partly from shock, partly from genuine amazement at what he was seeing. "I don't know," he admitted. "I hit the throttle and it kept running. I pulled the stick and it kept flying. It just wouldn't die. Every time I thought it was finished, it kept going, like it was too stubborn to quit." The photographer arrived and began documenting the damage from every angle. The photos would be distributed throughout the 8th Air Force, studied by engineers, analyzed by intelligence officers, and eventually find their way to Republic Aviation's engineering department in Farmingdale, Long Island. Alexander Kartveli, the P-47's chief designer, studied the photographs for a long time. His design team had built ruggedness into every aspect of the Thunderbolt: redundant systems, heavy structure, armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks. But even Kartveli hadn't quite believed his own design could survive this level of punishment. "We built it stronger than we needed to," he told his team. "We over-engineered everything because we didn't know what was enough. Turns out we built it exactly as strong as it needed to be." The photographs and Johnson's account were forwarded to German intelligence through various channels. The Air Force's technical analysis section studied them with growing concern. One engineer's note, found in captured German files after the war, stated, "If these images are accurate and not propaganda fabrications, the American P-47 possesses structural integrity that exceeds our theoretical maximums by at least 40%. This suggests a level of industrial precision in mass production that we cannot match." More importantly, the incident fundamentally changed how German pilots viewed the P-47. Hauptmann Galland, who'd led the initial attack on Johnson's formation, saw the photographs during an intelligence briefing and recognized the aircraft. He'd personally watched it absorb his cannon fire, had seen pieces flying off, had been certain it was going down. "This aircraft should not exist," Galland said flatly. "The damage here would destroy 3 Focke-Wulfs, 3 Messerschmitts. It should not be possible to fly this back to England. But he did, which means every assumption we've made about American structural design is wrong." The psychological impact rippled through German fighter units.
If the P-47 could absorb this much punishment and survive, how many more hits would it take? How much ammunition would pilots need to expend to ensure a kill? And if the Americans could build fighters this tough, what else were they capable of? Robert Johnson recovered from his wounds and returned to combat. He would go on to score 27 confirmed victories, becoming one of America's top aces. But he would forever be known as the pilot who refused to die, the man who flew home in an aircraft that should have been a smoking crater.
When asked about the incident years later, Johnson's response was typically modest. "The P-47 saved my life. I just steered it home. All credit goes to the engineers who built it and the factory workers who put it together. They built it tough enough to survive anything. I just got lucky enough to test that in the worst possible way." But among German pilots, the story took on a different tone. It became a cautionary tale, a warning. The fat American fighters that they'd laughed at, that they'd called flying milk bottles and pregnant cows, were beginning to reveal themselves as something far more dangerous. They were beginning to reveal themselves as nearly indestructible. July 1943. The conference room at Debden Airfield was packed with P-47 pilots from the 4th and 56th Fighter Groups. On the wall, a large tactical diagram showed altitude profiles, attack vectors, and energy management principles. At the front of the room stood Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, Hub to everyone who knew him, with a pointer in his hand and a determined expression on his face. Zemke was about to explain how to stop losing the war in the air. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won experience, "we have a problem, and the problem is not the P-47. The problem is us." He tapped the tactical diagram with his pointer. "For the past 3 months, we've been trying to fight German fighters using tactics designed for Spitfires and P-40s, tactics based on agility, on outturning the enemy, on traditional dogfighting, and it's getting us killed." The room was silent. The statistics told a grim story. In May and June 1943, P-47 units had lost 32 aircraft in combat, while claiming only 16 German fighters destroyed. A loss ratio that, if it continued, would bleed the 8th Fighter Command white within a year. "The problem," Zemke continued, "is that we're fighting on their terms. The Germans want us to turn with them because that's where their fighters excel. The Focke-Wulf and the Messerschmitt are lighter, more agile, better in turning combat below 25,000 feet. If we fight their fight, we lose. It's that simple." He moved to a different diagram, this one showing the P-47's performance curves compared to German fighters. "But look at this. Above 25,000 feet, the P-47 is faster than any German fighter in level flight. In a dive, nothing can catch us. We can reach speeds that would tear a Focke-Wulf apart. And in a zoom climb out of a high-speed dive, we can reach altitudes where German fighters are gasping for air." Captain Walker Bud Mahurin, who would become one of the first American aces in Europe, raised his hand. "Sir, are you saying we should avoid turning combat entirely?" "Not avoid, refuse. There's a difference. We don't engage on their terms, we dictate terms that favor our advantages. We use what the P-47 does better than any fighter in the sky: dive speed, zoom climb, and concentrated firepower."
He outlined what would become known as the boom and zoom tactic, though pilots would also call it the Thunderbolt turkey shoot. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. P-47 formations would climb to maximum altitude, 30,000 feet or higher, where the turbo-supercharged double Wasp engine still produced full power while German fighters struggled in the thin air. When Luftwaffe fighters appeared below, the Thunderbolts would roll inverted and dive, building tremendous speed. At the bottom of the dive, traveling at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour, the P-47s would make a single, high-speed firing pass. The closure rate would be so high that German pilots couldn't track them accurately. The relative motion made deflection shooting nearly impossible. And the 8 heavy machine guns converged at 300 yards would create a zone of destruction that anything caught in would not survive. After the firing pass, the Thunderbolts would use their retained energy to zoom climb back to altitude, beyond the reach of pursuing German fighters. Then, repeat the process. Dive, fire, climb. Dive, fire, climb. Like hawks stooping on prey, but with mathematical precision. The key, Zemke emphasized, is patience and discipline. You don't chase them down to low altitude where they have the advantage. You don't get drawn into turning fights. You stay high, you dive fast, you shoot once, and you climb back up. Let them come to you. Let them waste fuel and energy trying to reach you at altitude. Then kill them on your terms. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, recently returned to duty after his miraculous survival, spoke up. "Sir, what about when they're attacking the bombers? We're supposed to be escorts. If we stay at altitude while they're hitting the heavies?" "That's exactly when the tactic works best," Zemke interrupted. "German fighters attacking bombers are vulnerable. They have to slow down to make accurate firing passes. They have to present stable gun platforms. That's when you hit them. Dive through their formations at maximum speed. Your 8 guns firing for just 2 seconds puts 160 rounds into a target area the size of a truck. That's enough to destroy any aircraft ever built." He paused, looking around the room at the young faces. Most were barely in their 20s. Many had less than 100 hours of combat experience. But they were learning, adapting, evolving into something the Luftwaffe wasn't prepared to face. American fighter pilots who fought like Americans, using industrial strength, concentrated firepower, and overwhelming energy, rather than trying to match German agility and finesse. "One more thing," Zemke added. "The Germans have a saying, 'Altitude is life.' They're right. Height gives you options, energy, the ability to dictate combat. From now on, we climb high, we stay high, and we only come down to kill. Anyone who breaks this discipline and gets drawn into a low-altitude turning fight will answer to me. Is that clear?" The response was unanimous. "Yes, sir."
The transformation in American tactics began immediately. In the first week of August 1943, P-47 units using Zemke's boom and zoom approach achieved their first positive kill ratio, 12 German fighters destroyed for 6 P-47s lost. By the end of August, the ratio had improved to 2.5 to 1. More importantly, American pilots were beginning to understand their aircraft's true nature. The P-47 wasn't the dogfighter. It was a high-altitude predator, a diving hawk that struck with overwhelming speed and firepower, then climbed back to the sun before the prey even knew it was dead. Captain Mahurin scored his first 3 victories in a single mission on August 17th using pure boom and zoom tactics. His combat report described the methodology with scientific precision. Initial altitude, 32,000 feet. Spotted enemy formation, attacking B-17s at 26,000 feet. Rolled inverted and dove, reaching approximately 480 miles per hour indicated. Achieved firing position at 6 o'clock to enemy aircraft, range 300 yards. Fired 2-second burst. Observed strikes across entire fuselage and wing route. Enemy aircraft exploded, no evasive maneuver possible due to closure rate. Used retained energy to zoom climb to 30,000 feet. Repositioned over combat area. Repeated attack profile on second enemy aircraft with identical results. Third kill achieved using same tactic. Expended approximately 800 rounds total ammunition. No hits received. Return to base with ample fuel remaining. The efficiency was stunning. 3 kills, 800 rounds fired, no damage taken. This was industrial warfare applied to aerial combat. Maximize output, minimize losses, repeat the process until the enemy is exhausted. But the tactic required something many pilots found difficult: patience. The instinct, when you saw an enemy fighter, was to chase it, engage it, prove your skill in a turning fight. Zemke and the other squadron commanders had to constantly reinforce the discipline. "Let them go" became a common refrain. Let them burn fuel trying to reach you. Let them waste energy turning. You stay high. When they're worn out, exhausted, out of options, then you kill them. German pilots noticed the change in American tactics immediately. Hauptmann Hans Philipp, one of Germany's most successful aces with over 200 victories, filed a combat report in September 1943 that captured the new reality. The American P-47 pilots have learned from their early mistakes. They no longer attempt to engage in traditional fighter combat at medium altitudes. Instead, they remain at maximum altitude where their turbo-supercharged engines give them significant performance advantage. Their attacks come with little warning, fast dives from altitude that our pilots cannot intercept. The speed of their attack makes evasion nearly impossible. Their concentrated machine gun fire is devastatingly effective. One burst and the aircraft is usually destroyed completely. Most concerning, they show excellent discipline in not pursuing targets to low altitude.
Previous tactics of diving away and then outturning them at low level no longer work. They simply climb back to altitude and resume hunting. Recommendation: avoid combat with P-47s above 25,000 feet. If engagement is necessary, attack only when holding altitude advantage and energy state is favorable. Do not allow them to dictate combat terms. Previous tactics of diving away and then outturning them at low level no longer work. They simply climb back to altitude and resume hunting. Philip's recommendation revealed how completely the dynamic had shifted. The Luftwaffe, masters of aerial combat with years of experience, were now being told to avoid certain types of combat against American pilots who'd been in Europe less than 6 months. The transformation was psychological as much as tactical. American pilots were gaining confidence. German pilots were losing theirs. Lieutenant Eugene Roberts, arriving in England in September 1943, exemplified the new generation of P-47 pilots. His training in the United States had incorporated all the lessons learned in the first 6 months of European combat. He arrived with 420 hours in his logbook, including 75 hours in the P-47. He'd practiced boom and zoom attacks against towed targets. He'd studied gun camera footage from actual combat. He knew his aircraft's systems intimately. His first combat mission was a bomber escort to targets deep in Germany. The formation encountered 20 Messerschmitt's Bf-109s positioning to attack the bombers. Roberts, flying as wingman to an experienced pilot, followed his leader through a dive that accelerated them to over 450 miles per hour. The relative closure rate between the diving P-47s and the climbing Messerschmitts was nearly 600 miles per hour, roughly 900 feet per second. At that closing speed, the entire engagement from initial firing position to passing through the German formation took approximately 3 seconds. Roberts fired a single 2-second burst. His 8 guns put out 200 rounds in that time. His target? A Bf-109G, piloted by a German with less than 50 hours of combat experience, disintegrated. The German pilot never fired a shot, never took evasive action, never had time to process what was happening before he ceased to exist. Roberts' combat report was clinical. Followed leader in attack dive, acquired target, fired at 300-yard range, target destroyed. Zoom climbed to 29,000 feet. Total engagement time, approximately 10 seconds. Ammunition expended, 200 rounds. No damage received.
10 seconds from contact to kill to separation. This was the future of aerial combat, not romantic dogfights that lasted minutes, but brutal, high-speed engagements that were over before the opponent could react. The psychological toll on German pilots was mounting. They were being hunted by aircraft they couldn't catch, couldn't outclimb, and couldn't escape. The American fighters appeared above them like avenging angels, dove through their formations too fast to engage, destroyed their comrades with terrifying firepower, then climbed back to altitude before anyone could respond. And the Americans had one more advantage that was just beginning to manifest: numbers.
For every P-47 lost, 3 more arrived from the United States. American pilots who completed their combat tours were rotated home to train new pilots, spreading tactical lessons throughout the training pipeline. The entire system was designed for continuous improvement and scaling. Germany, by contrast, was bleeding experienced pilots it couldn't replace. Training was being shortened due to fuel shortages. New pilots arrived at combat units with barely 100 hours total flight time, less than American pilots got in advanced training alone. Every veteran lost was a hole that couldn't be filled. By October 1943, 6 months after the P-47 entered combat in Europe, the equation had shifted dramatically. American kill ratios had improved to 3-to-1 overall and 4-to-1 when using pure boom and zoom tactics. P-47 units were reliably achieving air superiority over German formations that outnumbered them. The fat American fighters that German pilots had laughed at in April were now the most feared aircraft in European skies. And the transformation was only beginning. The paddle blade propeller, improved variance, long-range capability, ground attack dominance, all of these were still to come. The P-47 Thunderbolt hadn't yet reached its full potential, but already German laughter had died, replaced by respect, then fear, and soon terror. Chapter 5. The Day the Bombers Found Protection. August 17, 1943. The twin raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg represented the 8th Air Force's deepest penetration into German airspace to date. 376 B-17 flying fortresses carrying nearly 1,000 tons of bombs, targeting ball-bearing factories and aircraft manufacturing plants critical to German war production. It was also the day the Luftwaffe learned what American heavy machine guns could do to their specialized bomber killers. Major David Schilling led the 62nd Fighter Squadron that morning, climbing through towering cumulus clouds over the English Channel in his P-47D. Behind him, 47 more Thunderbolts spread across the sky in combat formation, their turbo-supercharged engines pulling them steadily toward 30,000 feet. The mission profile was brutally simple. Escort the bombers as deep into Germany as fuel would allow, protect them from German fighters during the most vulnerable part of their mission, then return to England before the fuel tanks ran dry. With standard internal fuel, P-47s could barely reach the German border before having to turn back. Today, they carried new 108-gallon drop tanks under their wings, extending their range to nearly 350 miles, enough to reach the target area and provide escort during the critical bombing run. Intelligence had warned them what to expect. The Luftwaffe had developed specialized tactics for attacking American heavy bomber formations, using twin-engine fighters armed with heavy cannon and rockets. The Messerschmitt Bf-110 destroyer and the Me-410 could carry enough firepower to break up bomber formations before the B-17's defensive guns could effectively respond.
But the Luftwaffe hadn't counted on what would happen when P-47s encountered these heavily armed, relatively unmaneuverable bomber killers. Schilling's formation reached the rendezvous point with the bombers at 28,000 feet over the Dutch border. Below and ahead, the B-17 formation was a magnificent sight. 300 heavy bombers in tight combat boxes, contrails streaming behind them like white ribbons against the blue sky. The bomber crews, seeing the P-47s arrive overhead, transmitted simple messages. "Thanks for coming. Things are about to get interesting." They weren't wrong. At 28,500 feet, Schilling spotted the German formation. 12 Bf-110s and 8 Me-410s, positioning at the bomber's altitude, preparing to make a head-on attack with their heavy 30mm cannon and air-to-air rockets. The German destroyer aircraft preferred the head-on pass. It minimized their exposure to the bomber's defensive fire while maximizing their own weapons' effectiveness against the B-17's vulnerable nose sections. "Keyworth Squadron," Schilling transmitted, using his unit's call sign. "Bandits at 11 o'clock level. Heavy twins setting up for attack run. We're going down through them. Remember, they can't maneuver like single-engine fighters. They're target practice if we get position." He rolled his P-47 inverted and pulled through, entering a 45-degree dive that would intercept the German formation. Behind him, his entire squadron followed in perfect section. 48 Thunderbolts diving toward 20 German destroyer aircraft, building speed with every second. Unteroffizier Hinrich Roth, rear gunner in one of the Bf-110s, saw them coming. He'd been in combat for nearly 2 years, had survived the Battle of Britain and the Eastern Front. He recognized what he was seeing. American fighters making a high-speed attack run from altitude. "Fighters!" he shouted into his intercom. "P-47s diving on us from above, range 2,000 meters and closing fast." His pilot, a veteran with 300 hours in the Bf-110, began evasive maneuvers. But the destroyer aircraft was designed for firepower, not agility. Its twin 2,100 horsepower engines gave it respectable speed in level flight, but in maneuvering, especially with its heavy weapons load, it handled like a truck.
The left wing folded back against the fuselage, then tore free completely. The crew compartment, where 2 men had been sitting alive and functional 2 seconds earlier, shredded into metal confetti. The engines, torn free from their mounts, tumbled separately toward the ground. The entire destruction sequence took less than 1.5 seconds from first impact to final disintegration, all from a 2-second burst of 8.50 caliber machine guns. Roth's pilot was screaming something, but Roth couldn't process the words. He was watching the debris cloud where his squadron mate's aircraft had been, his mind trying to reconcile what his eyes were telling him. Aircraft didn't just disintegrate like that. Aircraft were hit, caught fire, fell spinning, gave crews time to bail out. They didn't just vanish. Then the P-47s were through their formation, having shot down 8 Bf-110s and Me-410s in a single pass. 8 aircraft destroyed in approximately 10 seconds of total engagement time. The German survivors scattered, their attack run completely disrupted, their carefully planned formation torn apart by the violence of the American attack. The B-17s continued on to target, their crews not even realizing how close they'd come to facing the full fury of German destroyer attack. The P-47s climbed back to altitude, reformed, and resumed their escort position as if nothing remarkable had happened. For Major Schilling, nothing remarkable had happened. This was simply the P-47 being employed properly, using altitude, speed, and concentrated firepower to destroy the enemy before they could threaten the bombers. It was textbook boom and zoom tactics applied to destroyer aircraft instead of single-engine fighters. But those same destroyer aircraft, heavily armed and armored against bomber defensive fire, were helpless against the diving attacks of American fighters armed with 8 heavy machine guns. The destroyers couldn't evade, couldn't outclimb, couldn't match the dive speed of pursuing Thunderbolts. They were, as Schilling had coldly observed, target practice. Hinrich Roth survived the war and was interviewed in 1962 about his experiences.
His description of the August 17th engagement captured the psychological impact. "We thought we were the predators. We had the heavy cannon, the rockets, the armor. We were designed to kill bombers, and we were good at it. But when those P-47s came down on us, we became the prey. The speed was unbelievable. They appeared above us, and then they were through us before we could react. The sound of those 8 machine guns firing together, it wasn't like normal gunfire.
It was like a continuous roar, like standing next to a waterfall made of metal. And the destruction. I watched aircraft ahead of me simply cease to exist, not shot down, destroyed, transformed from functioning machines into clouds of debris in less time than it takes to blink. After that day, when intelligence told us P-47s were escorting the bombers, many crews found reasons not to fly. Equipment problems, illness, anything to avoid facing those guns again. The Americans called them thunderbolts. We called them Donnerschlag, thunderclap, because when you heard that sound, you knew death had arrived. The August 17th mission marked a turning point in the strategic bombing campaign. For the first time, American heavy bombers had penetrated deep into Germany with effective fighter escort. The Luftwaffe had thrown everything it had at the formations: single-engine fighters, destroyer aircraft, even experimental rocket-armed interceptors. And the P-47s had created a protective umbrella that the Germans couldn't penetrate without suffering catastrophic losses. The numbers told the story. Of the 376 B-17s that participated in the twin raids, 60 were lost, a brutal 16% loss rate that couldn't be sustained long-term. But of those 60 losses, only 8 occurred during the portion of the mission when P-47s were present. The remaining 52 were lost during the final approach to targets and the return flight, when the Thunderbolts had to turn back due to fuel limitations. The Luftwaffe lost 47 fighters destroyed in combat with P-47 escorts alone, not counting additional losses to bomber defensive fire. Among those destroyed were 12 specialized destroyer aircraft, representing irreplaceable airframes and experienced crews. The mathematics were becoming undeniable. German losses were mounting faster than replacements could arrive. American losses, while heavy, were being replaced within weeks. New B-17s rolled off production lines daily. New P-47s arrived in England by the hundreds. New pilots, thoroughly trained and equipped, joined the squadrons constantly, and the American fighters were getting better. October 8, 1943. Oberstleutnant Hans Philipp climbed away from his base at Stendal, Germany, in his Focke-Wulf A6. At 206 confirmed victories, he was one of the Luftwaffe's most successful aces. He'd flown over 500 combat missions on both the Eastern and Western fronts. He'd survived the Battle of Britain, Operation Barbarossa, and 3 years of continuous combat. He would not survive this day. Philipp led Jagdgeschwaden 1 into combat that morning against a large formation of B-17s attacking targets near Bremen. Intelligence reports indicated the bombers would be escorted by P-47s, which concerned Philipp. He'd read the tactical analyses about the American fighters, had studied the combat reports from other units. He knew the Thunderbolts were becoming increasingly dangerous, but he also knew his duty. The bombers had to be stopped. Germany's war production depended on it. His orders were clear: attack the bombers at any cost. The interception took place at 28,000 feet. Philipp positioned his formation of 24 fighters above the bomber stream, preparing for a diving attack that would carry them through the B-17 formations and their defensive fire. Standard Luftwaffe tactic: build speed in the dive, make a high deflection firing pass, then use the retained energy to zoom back to altitude. What Philipp didn't know, what his radar coverage hadn't detected,
was that the 56th Fighter Group was already positioned at 32,000 feet, 4,000 feet above his formation. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, leading the 56th, watched the German fighters positioning for their attack run. He recognized the tactical setup. The Germans would dive through the bombers, present difficult deflection shots, then climb away before the P-47s could respond. Except the P-47s weren't below them this time. They were above, with altitude advantage, energy advantage, and position advantage. Zemke's Wolfpack, Hubert's transmitted, using his group's nickname. Target the leaders first. They're the experienced pilots. Kill them, and the formation falls apart. Tally-ho! The 56th Fighter Group rolled inverted and dove. 48 P-47s accelerating through 400 miles per hour, diving on German fighters who didn't know they were there. Hans Philipp had excellent situational awareness, a survival skill honed through 3 years of combat. He scanned above and behind constantly, checking 6 o'clock high, the classic bounce position. But at 28,000 feet, in a Focke-Wulf FW-190A6, his aircraft was already straining. The BMW 801 radio engine, powerful at medium altitudes, was gasping in the thin air. His controls felt mushy, less responsive than they should be. The fighter that was nimble and deadly at 15,000 feet felt like it was trying to swim through honey up here. When his wingman screamed, "Indianer above," Philipp tried to react, tried to brake hard right and dive away, using the FW-190's excellent roll rate to evade. But at 28,000 feet, the dive that would have saved him at lower altitude was too slow. His engine, already at maximum power, couldn't accelerate the aircraft quickly enough. The thin air meant less thrust, less lift, less everything, except altitude. And altitude was exactly what the Americans had. Robert Johnson, now an experienced pilot with 15 victories to his credit, was flying as element leader in the 61st Fighter Squadron. He'd learned everything Zemke could teach about using the P-47's advantages. Today, those lessons would be applied with lethal efficiency.
50 caliber machine guns loaded and ready, the target's identity was irrelevant. Range, 400 yards. 350. 300. Johnson fired. The convergence zone of all 8 guns intersected directly in the path of Philipp's fighter. In 1.8 seconds, 180 half-inch projectiles hammered the Focke-Wulf. The concentration was devastating. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds punched through the aircraft's armored fuel tank, the self-sealing mechanism unable to cope with the volume of punctures. Standard ball ammunition severed control cables, smashed hydraulic lines, shattered the canopy frame. Tracer rounds ignited hydraulic fluid and fuel vapors. The Focke-Wulf exploded. Not caught fire. Exploded. The fuel tank detonated, the blast propagating through the aircraft structure faster than the materials could absorb. The entire aircraft came apart in a spherical expansion of flame and fragments. Hans Philipp died instantly. His 3 years of combat experience, his 206 victories, his tactical innovations, all rendered meaningless by 1.8 seconds of concentrated American firepower at 28,000 feet. Johnson pulled up from his attack. The nose of his P-47 pointed nearly vertical as he converted speed back to altitude. His wingman had gotten another German fighter in the same pass. 2 kills in 10 seconds of combat. The rest of the 56th Fighter Group was slashing through the disintegrating German formation, their 8-gun salvos destroying aircraft after aircraft. Of the 24 German fighters that had been preparing to attack the bombers, 11 were destroyed in less than 2 minutes. The survivors scattered, their attack completely disrupted, fleeing toward any cloud cover they could find. The bombers continued to target unmolested. News of Philipp's death spread through the Luftwaffe fighter force like wildfire. If Hans Philipp, with his experience, his skill, his 206 victories, could be killed by an American pilot in a single pass, what chance did ordinary pilots have? The psychological impact was profound. Philipp wasn't just another pilot, he was one of the legends.
The Luftwaffe had promoted him as a hero, used his image in recruitment posters, cited his tactical innovations in training manuals. And he'd been killed in seconds by a pilot who'd been in combat for barely 4 months. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, commander of the Luftwaffe fighter force, ordered an immediate investigation into the circumstances of Philip's death. The report, based on radio transcripts, gun camera footage from surviving German pilots, an interrogation to a captured P-47 pilot shot down later that day, was delivered to Galland on October 12th. The report's conclusion was blunt. The P-47, when employed at altitudes above 28,000 feet with proper tactical doctrine, represents a superior weapon system to all current Luftwaffe fighter types. The combination of turbo-supercharged engine performance, structural strength, concentrated firepower, and improved American pilot training creates a capability we cannot match.
Most significantly, the loss of experienced flight leaders like Oberstleutnant Philipp cannot be replaced. The Americans can afford to trade inexperienced pilots for our aces because they have unlimited pilot production capacity. We cannot afford to lose any more experienced leaders, yet under current tactical conditions, such losses are inevitable. Galland read the report 3 times, then filed it in his safe rather than forwarding it to Reich Marshal Hermann Göring. The conclusions were too pessimistic, too defeatist. Göring would likely have had the report's authors arrested for undermining morale. But Galland knew the analysis was correct. The mathematics of attrition were working inexorably against Germany. Every experienced pilot lost was a hole that couldn't be filled. Every victory claimed by the P-47s was replaced within weeks by fresh American pilots who'd been trained to specifically exploit the Thunderbolt's strengths. The Luftwaffe was fighting an enemy that learned from mistakes, adapted tactics, and had infinite resources. Germany was fighting on doctrine established before the war, with dwindling fuel, shrinking pilot training programs, and no margin for error. And now the Americans were flying fighters that German pilots feared. January 1944. The first P-47 D-22s began arriving in England, and pilots immediately noticed something different about these new Thunderbolts. The propeller looked wrong, too wide, too broad, like someone had taken boat oars and mounted them on the nose of a fighter. The Hamilton Standard hydromatic propeller with paddle blades measured 13 feet in diameter, the same as previous models, but the blades themselves were fundamentally different. Instead of the narrow, blade-like profile of conventional propellers, these had broad, squared-off tips that gave them their distinctive appearance. Ground crews joked that the new propellers looked like Republic had stolen them from a riverboat. Pilots wondered if the ungainly-looking blades would affect performance. The first test flight answered that question definitively. Captain Gerald Johnson, no relation to Robert, climbed into one of the new P-47 D-22s for an evaluation flight. At sea level, he pushed the throttle to takeoff power, released the brakes, and felt the Thunderbolt surge forward with noticeably more acceleration than the earlier models. Rotation speed, 80 knots. Liftoff, 95 knots. The big fighter leapt off the runway and into a climb that felt nothing like the earlier Thunderbolt's sluggish performance at low altitude. Johnson checked his rate of climb indicator, 3,000 feet per minute at sea level. The earlier P-47Cs and early D models could barely manage 2,200 feet per minute. This was a 36% improvement in climb rate. At 10,000 feet, the rate was still 2,800 feet per minute. At 20,000 feet, where earlier Thunderbolts really began to shine, the paddle blade model was climbing at 3,200 feet per minute, faster at 20,000 feet than the old models at sea level.
Johnson leveled off at 25,000 feet and made test notes on his kneeboard. New propeller configuration transforms low-medium altitude performance.
Aircraft climbs like a completely different fighter. High-altitude performance appears equal to or better than previous variants. Rate of roll improved. Acceleration in level flight improved. No adverse handling characteristics noted. The paddle blade propeller did was solve the P-47's one remaining weakness: poor climb performance at low altitude. The broad blades bit into the air more efficiently, converting the double Wasp engine's enormous horsepower into thrust more effectively than the narrow blades. The result was a fighter that could now compete with German fighters at all altitudes, not just above 25,000 feet. The tactical implications were immediate and significant. When the paddle blade Thunderbolts entered combat in February 1944, German pilots discovered that the fat American fighters had learned to climb. The previous tactic of diving away and outclimbing the P-47s at low altitude no longer worked. The Thunderbolts could follow them down and follow them back up, matching or exceeding climb rates while maintaining their devastating firepower advantage. Hauptmann Heinz Knock of Jagdgeschwader 11, a veteran with over 200 combat missions, encountered the new P-47 variants near Hanover in February. His combat diary entry captured the shock. Quote, February 14, 1944. We bounced a formation of American fighters near Hanover, expecting to use our usual advantage in climb rate. They turned into us, aggressive, not defensive as before, and climbed with us. At 15,000 feet, they were matching our rate. At 20,000, they were pulling away. Schmidt was caught during the climb. I watched his FW-190 simply disintegrate under fire from one of the new American fighters. Nothing left but smoke and fragments. Quote, these are not the same Thunderbolts we faced in 1943. They climb as well as we do. They turn nearly as well at altitude. They're faster at all heights. And those 8 machine guns, when they hit, nothing survives. We tried to disengage by diving. 3 of them followed us down. At 10,000 feet, altitude where we should have advantage, they were matching our dive and gaining. Only broken clouds allowed our escape. The conclusion is unavoidable. We no longer have any altitude where we hold significant advantage over the P-47. They own the sky from ground level to 40,000 feet." Unquote. The paddle blade propeller did more than improve performance. It changed the sound of the Thunderbolt. The broad tips, reaching supersonic speeds at high RPM, created a distinctive roaring thunder that could be heard from miles away. German ground troops reported being able to identify approaching P-47s by sound alone, a deep, threatening rumble that meant death from above. Luftwaffe pilots began calling them Donnerschlag. The name was part respect, part fear, part acknowledgement that the balance of power had shifted irrevocably.
But the propeller upgrade was only one of several improvements arriving in early 1944. The P-47D-25 and later variants incorporated improved cockpit visibility with a bubble canopy that eliminated the original razorback fuselage profile behind the pilot. The new canopy provided 360-degree visibility, making it nearly impossible to sneak up on a P-47 pilot. A water methanol injection system that boosted engine power to 2,300 horsepower for short periods, providing emergency performance when needed most. Increased fuel capacity with wet wings, additional internal fuel tanks built into the wing structure, raising total internal capacity to 370 gallons. Combined with external drop tanks, operational range exceeded 1,000 miles. Underwing hardpoints that could carry either additional fuel tanks, bombs up to 1,000 pounds each, or high-velocity aircraft rockets. The P-47 was evolving from pure fighter into a multi-role fighter bomber. The transformation from flying milk bottle to flying death was now complete. The P-47D-25 could outclimb, outdive, outrun, and outlast any German fighter at any altitude.
It could carry a bomb load equal to early war medium bombers while retaining full fighter capability. And it could absorb battle damage that would destroy 3 conventional fighters and still return home. Major Walter "Bud" Mahoran, now an ace with 19 victories, filed a tactical evaluation report in March 1944 that summarized the new capabilities. The P-47D with paddle blade propeller and bubble canopy represents the most capable fighter bomber in any Air Force. Performance equals or exceeds all enemy types at all altitudes. Firepower is overwhelming. 8.50 caliber guns with 3,400 rounds total ammunition can sustain fire for 34 seconds, enough to destroy multiple targets in a single engagement. Structural strength borders on the miraculous. I have personally witnessed P-47s return from missions with damage that should have resulted in structural failure. Wing spars shot through, fuselage members severed, control surfaces mostly destroyed, yet the aircraft brought their pilots home. Most importantly, the aircraft's versatility allows it to perform multiple roles in a single mission: fighter escort at high altitude, bomber attack at medium altitude, ground support at low altitude. This flexibility forces the enemy to defend at all altitudes simultaneously, a task they lack the resources to accomplish. Conclusion: the Luftwaffe fighter force cannot survive sustained combat against P-47-equipped units using proper tactics. The only question is how long they can delay the inevitable. Mahoran's assessment was prophetic. By April 1944, German fighter losses exceeded 1,000 aircraft per month. The Luftwaffe was being systematically destroyed, not through dramatic air battles, but through relentless attrition. Every day, more experienced German pilots died. Every day, less capable replacements arrived with insufficient training. Every day, more P-47s filled the skies over Europe.
April 1944. Oberstleutnant Hans von Luck commanded the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment in northern France. A veteran of Poland, France, Russia, and North Africa, von Luck considered himself unshakable under fire. He'd faced British artillery at El Alamein, Soviet Katyusha rockets at Kursk, and naval bombardment during the Italian campaign. None of it prepared him for what the P-47 Thunderbolt could do as a ground attack aircraft. The first indication of trouble came at 09:45 hours on April 18th. Von Luck was leading a column of 20 trucks and 8 half-tracks, moving supplies toward defensive positions being prepared for the anticipated Allied invasion. It was a clear morning, visibility excellent, perfect weather for air attack, but von Luck had calculated they would reach cover before Allied fighters could respond to their movement. He was wrong. The first warning was the sound, not the high-pitched whine of diving Stukas or the whistle of falling bombs. A deep, rumbling roar that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Von Luck looked up, searching for the source. 4 P-47s were already in their attack dive, coming from directly ahead, so low they were barely clearing the treetops. The lead aircraft was perhaps 800 meters away and closing fast. Too fast for the convoy to disperse. Too fast for the mounted machine guns to track effectively. Von Luck shouted, "Air attack!" and dove for the ditch beside the road. Around him, soldiers were scattering, abandoning vehicles, running for any cover they could find. The Thunderbolts opened fire at 300 meters. 48 50 caliber machine guns, 12 per aircraft, 4 aircraft total, poured concentrated fire into the convoy stalled. The sound was unlike anything von Luck had experienced. Not the rattling of rifle-caliber machine guns or the thumping of cannon. A continuous roaring that drowned out even the radial engine's thunder. The effect on the convoy was catastrophic. The lead truck simply exploded, its fuel tank ignited by armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The vehicle behind it was cut in half, the cab separated from the bed by a stream of half-inch projectiles traveling at 2,900 feet per second. A half-track attempting to turn off the road disintegrated, its thin armor no protection against the concentrated fire. Von Luck pressed himself into the ditch, hands over his head as debris rained around him. The sound of the guns merged with the shriek of ricochets, the explosions of burning vehicles, and the screams of wounded men. The attack lasted 8 seconds. 8 seconds from when the first Thunderbolt opened fire until the last one pulled up from its strafing run and climbed away. In those 8 seconds, 20 vehicles were destroyed or damaged beyond use. 34 men were dead. 56 were wounded. The convoy had been transformed from an organized military movement into a smoking catastrophe scattered across 300 meters of French road.
Von Luck lifted his head from the ditch and stared at the devastation. Fire was spreading from vehicle to vehicle. Ammunition in the destroyed trucks was cooking off, adding sporadic explosions to the chaos. The acrid smell of burning rubber, fuel, and flesh filled the air. "Sir," his adjutant called from further down the ditch, "aircraft returning!" Von Luck looked up in horror. The 4 P-47s had climbed to 2,000 meters, circled, and were now positioning for a second attack run. But this time, they were carrying something under their wings that looked like enormous cylinders. "They're not aircraft," Von Luck muttered, watching the Thunderbolts line up for their attack. "They are flying artillery." The P-47s came in lower this time, barely 50 meters above the ground. Von Luck watched, fascinated and terrified, as smoke trails appeared beneath the wings. 5 trails from each aircraft, 10 from each pair, 20 total. High-velocity aircraft rockets, each one equivalent to a 105mm artillery shell, streaked toward the remains of the convoy at over 1,000 feet per second. The explosions as they impacted were deafening. Trees were torn apart. The road was cratered. Vehicles that had escaped the first pass were shredded by the blast effects. And then the Thunderbolts opened fire with their machine guns again, maintaining the attack during the rocket runs. When the 4 P-47s finally pulled up and headed west toward Allied lines, Von Luck's regiment had ceased to exist as a functional unit. Of 20 vehicles, 0 were operational. Of 200 men, 34 were dead, 89 were wounded, and the rest were traumatized survivors who would flinch at every aircraft engine sound for the rest of their lives. Von Luck wrote in his diary that evening, "Today we experience the future of warfare. The American P-47 is not a fighter that can also attack ground targets. It is a weapon system designed to destroy everything. Fighters at altitude, bombers at medium height, and ground forces anywhere they can be found. The sound of those engines, the roar of those guns, the shrieking of those rockets, it creates a psychological effect beyond the physical damage. Men who faced Soviet artillery without breaking are now terrified of clear skies. The moment they hear that distinctive thunder, they abandon vehicles and run for cover. Discipline breaks down. Units cease to function. The Americans don't just destroy equipment, they destroy the will to resist. If this is what we will face when the invasion comes, I do not see how we can stop them." Von Luck's experience was being repeated across occupied Europe. The P-47, initially designed as a high-altitude interceptor, had evolved into the most feared ground attack aircraft of the war. Its combination of heavy armor, making it resistant to small arms fire and light anti-aircraft weapons, enormous weapons load, long range, and devastating firepower made it uniquely capable in the ground support role. The standard ground attack loadout for a P-47 D-25 in spring 1944 was formidable.
50 caliber machine guns with 3,400 rounds total, armor-piercing incendiary mixture optimized for penetrating vehicle armor and igniting fuel. 2 1,000-pound bombs under the wings, 1 500-pound bomb under the fuselage,